Hi, I'm Steve Clemons, and I have a question. As Israel's war on Gaza enters its third month, has the Palestine-Israel conflict become unsolvable? Let's get to the bottom line. In the words of UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, in Gaza, there is just nowhere safe to go and very little to survive on. Israeli forces destroyed most of the northern part of the Gaza Strip and pushed 1 million people southward. And now it's intensely bombing the 2 million people stuck there. More than 16,000 Palestinians have been killed by Israel, almost 7,000 of them children. To put that in perspective, the U.S. killed about 12,000 Iraqi civilians in the first 9 months of the invasion of Iraq in 2003. Israel says it won't stop until it defeats Hamas, which launched an attack on October 7th, killing 1,200 Israelis and taking more than 200 as captives. More than 100 of those captives have now been released during a pause in the fighting. But there are no signs of a ceasefire now. So where is the war heading, and how is it affecting the wider region and the U.S.? Today we're talking with Stephen Cook, Senior Fellow for the Middle East and North Africa at the Council on Foreign Relations and author of the upcoming book, The End of Ambition, America's Past, Present, and Future in the Middle East. Stephen, thank you so much for joining us. Let me just start with the book, The End of Ambition. What should our ambition be in a region right now that is convulsing violently? It's got to be one of the worst conflicts in this modern era when you look at the rate of death going on. I mean, you have written a piece in Foreign Policy magazine saying there's really no hope for any option.
Yeah, it's really the worst conflict that I've encountered in my 20 years working on the Middle East as a professional. I came into this just as the United States was invading Iraq, and as you point out, the casualty figures in such a short period of time are indeed quite shocking. The problem is that any idea that anybody might have with regard to finally resolving the conflict between Palestinians and Israelis have either been tried before or are politically non-starters. We are at a stalemate between Palestinians and Israelis, and we were at that stalemate even before this conflict began. That is to say that the minimum requirements that the Palestinians have for peace are things that the Israelis politically are unable to deliver, and that Israel's minimum requirements for peace are things that politically the Palestinians are unable to deliver. And so we have stalemate, we have continued settlement, which looks more and more like annexation, and of course, periodic spasms of horrific violence like we've been seeing since October 7th.
Is the United States, I want to focus on the U.S. debate for a moment. It seems so Orwellian to me. You know, I know Matthew Miller, who's the Department of State spokesperson, and he made this statement.
I have not seen evidence that they are intentionally killing civilians. We believe that far too many civilians have been killed. But again, this goes back to the underlying problem of this entire situation.
I also hear Lloyd Austin say that Israel risks strategic defeat unless it moves to protect Palestinian civilians. And I'm like, is anybody watching the TVs, hearing the UN? We've seen what's going on. But is there a kind of willful disregard for the fact that, you know, to the point of Matthew Miller, yes, we're seeing civilians intentionally killed?
Well, this is, I think, the most difficult issue in this conflict, and the United States is stuck here because the president believed that if he hugged the Israelis, he could shape their military operations, which I think given...
Hugging means support them, be totally supportive of Netanyahu,
exactly.
Come in and whisper in his ear and say, don't be so bad, right?
Exactly.
How's that going?
How's that strategy? I think it was a miscalculation, and I think it's surprising that it was a miscalculation because of the way in which the Israelis have framed this conflict. After what happened on October 7th, footage that, if you have seen it, is shocking. Words don't actually capture how shocking and violent and, quite honestly, barbaric that those attacks were. And subsequently, the Israelis have defined this conflict in existential terms. And I think that the administration miscalculated, not understanding, or at least underestimating the way in which the Israelis were going to pursue their military operations, given the fact that they had defined this conflict in existential terms, and overestimating their ability to shape the way in which these military operations are unfolding. There's clearly an effort on the part of the Israelis to demoralize Palestinian society, and in this way separate them from Hamas. I think we can see from whatever public opinion we can glean from Gaza and the West Bank, quite honestly, that this is having actually the opposite effect in terms
Stephen,
of public
we know
opinion.
from WikiLeaks that the United States and Israelis discussed Gaza in past years. And there's a piece in the WikiLeaks discussions that basically said Israel was only willing to allow Gaza enough economic activity to barely be above subsistence. It's a fairly, bone-chilling treatment that kind of looked at the way in which Gaza was never set up for success. Why would a nation like Israel think that demoralizing the Palestinians after what they've been doing? I mean, it kind of raises the question, what were the state of affairs on October 6th?
Right. Well, look, if you remember, after Israel's withdrawal from Gaza in 2005, there was all kinds of efforts on the UN, the Clinton Global Initiative, other international NGOs to try to help develop the Gaza Strip. Obviously, that did not work. There was huge and tremendous and quite violent political divisions within Gaza itself. And all those good plans were laid waste as a result of the competition between Hamas and Fatah, the PLO. Since then, the Israelis have sought to essentially cordon off, with the help of the Egyptians, cordon off the Gaza Strip. And as you said, leave it in a subsistence kind of way. The idea was to establish a deterrence between Israel and Hamas.
Right.
That was shattered on October 7th. And it strikes me that the Israelis want to completely wash their hands of the Gaza Strip, but not before they destroy Hamas, however they define it. It is going to be, as you said, something that is unfolding before our eyes that is going to kill many, many people. The Israelis believe that as they intensify their military operations and demoralize the Palestinian public, it will isolate Hamas in Palestinian society. As I said, I don't think that that's likely to happen.
You know, one of America's political leaders who's clearly evolved since this crisis began is Senator Bernie Sanders. He was all in, give Israel support, was on every level. He's now written a letter to his colleagues and said America can no longer be complicit in the indiscriminate killing of civilians, and that is Benjamin Netanyahu's plan. He basically says Netanyahu is not at war with Hamas. Netanyahu is at war with the Palestinians. Mm-hmm. We cannot be complicit in that, and he's opposing this larger funding package for Israel in that. I'm interested in your views on it because even you had a case that's just emerged, today. I mean, it's interns, but nonetheless, we have divided institutions. State Department staff resigning or sending letters to Anthony Blinken, the Secretary of State, basically expressing great concern that we have become unobjective in this relationship. You have 40 interns inside the White House working for the Office of the President, the Office of the Vice President, who have signed a letter that essentially said they have great concern about where this is going. So I'm just interested in what this is doing to us to divide it and how you think that's going to play out.
I think as far as Capitol Hill interns and staff, I think they serve at the pleasure of the people who were elected representatives. Right. If they don't like the policy, they can leave. Interns, it's a privilege to be an intern in the White House. I think that I would take a...
I know it's interns, but nonetheless,
yeah,
it's an interesting
interns
act.
can have differing opinions. But when you sign on to pursue a policy, and they have
but I
every
guess
right.
it's interesting not to sign on, but is an interesting take of the temperature of the times, and when you kind of look at, say, the Democratic arena, which is President Biden's party. You see declining support and a kind of paralysis in his foreign policy numbers because of this crisis and the way he's responded, and differences as a view inside that party.
It's undoubtedly the case that the politics of Israel is changing in the United States, but in particular within the Democratic Party. But if I could just finish my point on the interns and congressional staff, they have recourse. They have written their letters. They can also resign their positions. It is somewhat, in our system, it is somewhat, I think, presumptuous for Capitol Hill staff who were not elected to be taking this position against the people who they serve and against the people who elected the people they serve. But it does speak to your point, which is that there are very, very serious differences of opinion within the United States on the question of our support for Israel, particularly our support for Israel during this military operation that we would not have seen 15, 20, 25 years ago. And I think that it's important to recognize that the politics of Israel is changing in this country in important important ways.
I want to play a clip for you from President Biden when he met President Abbas in Bethlehem last year. Let's listen.
So even if the ground is not ripe at this moment to restart negotiations, the United States and my administration will not give up on trying to bring the Palestinians and Israelis and both sides closer together.
Stephen, you've written a powerful piece. It was very depressing for me, but I think it was very realistic on the different perspectives of the players around the Israel-Palestine standoff. Here we have President Biden last year saying that, the situation is not ripe. It raises the question of whether it will ever be ripe. Or thinking, as he's now called, for a return to a two-state solution and somehow seeing an Israeli peace camp somewhere being. Take us through the blind spots that each has on the day after solutions for this crisis.
Well, look, I think the administration had not actually really wanted to deal with this issue. President Biden, people forget that as
he shoved it under the rug.
Right, as vice president, he oversaw negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians that were convened by then Secretary of State John Kerry, and he came to the conclusion that there really was no way forward, and had avoided this other than his meeting with Abbas in Bethlehem. In which he basically mouthed a kind of formula about the two-state solution. I think going forward, I think any plan that the current Secretary of State, Secretary Blinken, about an international force in the Gaza Strip for the day after, a reinvigorated Palestinian authority, an authority that is corrupt, dysfunctional, lacks legitimacy, in part because of its cooperation with Israel and the United States, as well as the fact that Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, hasn't stood for election. He's in the 18th year of a four-year term, as people like to say. And I think there is no peace camp. There's no peace camp among the Israelis. I think after this conflict... Let me just stop
you there for a minute. We are nonetheless, behind closed doors, talking about the Palestinian Authority somehow getting back in shape and back in gear. I mean, all the things you write about that say likely can't happen, those are the things we're actually discussing.
Yeah, it's an unrealistic thing, but the administration, and I think the people around him, and I think most of Washington, are bereft of any ideas about how to go forward. I think the American foreign policy establishment is appalled by what happened on October 7th, has grave questions about the Israeli military operations since then, but doesn't have an answer. Can't bring around into their heads the idea that whatever ideas that we have advanced over the course of the previous 25 or 30 years didn't work then and still don't work now. And my fear is that without any new ideas, we're going to return to some very, very disturbing version of the status quo, in which you have a security regime over the Gaza Strip, destitution of the people on the Gaza Strip, but no real movement towards the resolution of the conflict. I think that's a more likely outcome of this than a two-state solution and real peace negotiations that would finally bring this terrible conflict to an end.
Another dimension of this, which is not getting a lot of coverage, is what's happening on the West Bank and settler provocations, even murders, attacks on Palestinians there. This was a distinct and different area that was not engaged in the October 7th Hamas attacks against Israel, and yet violence is rising there. Are we not paying enough attention to the dangers of the West Bank?
Absolutely. I think all the focus has been on the north and Hezbollah, but some of us have been saying that the real danger of escalation is the West Bank. First, there is a reservoir of support for Hamas on the West Bank, and you have a radical settler community that has been empowered by ministers in the Israeli government who are intent on annexing territory in the West Bank and, quite frankly, driving Palestinians from their land. It is as clear as day that that is what their intention is. Now, the administration, the Biden administration, has begun to sanction some of these people, not giving them visas. Sanctions would hurt, especially among the American contingent, which is larger than people think, among the settler community. But there is a real risk, a real danger of this escalating in ways that could lead to, once again, real concerns about the Palestinian population of the West Bank and where they might go. That is something that ministers in the Israeli government have actually talked about. That is population transfer, otherwise known as ethnic cleansing.
But I would also say that what I see happening to America's standing in the world, I'm not saying it's falling, but it's definitely being assailed by other nations that see us holding to a double standard. We see a deep divide even in Europe right now.
Right.
You know,
but
and
I
nations,
wonder,
so
that is certainly true, but I wonder how different that really is. I mean, what's different is the kind of shocking violence of this war.
Right.
But for as long as I have been working on the Middle East, for as long as you have been working on and traveling to the Middle East, you have heard about America's double standards.
Yes.
I think what's different now, that's different from the last 30 years, is that there are actually competitors, near-peer competitors to the United States in the world. China being one of them. India, much more influential in the Middle East than it once was. Even Russia, which isn't really a near-peer competitor of the United States, has influence in the region and particularly in the global south.
I mean, I've been watching Erdogan and Turkey basically, put stakes in this as well.
Right.
Is that a good thing that maybe, as I sort of look at it, the United States has been defending Israel's right to defend itself, and this defense of itself is resulting in thousands of deaths of innocents, while we are still trying to support and aid those innocents. It looks like you've given permission to kill, but you're trying to help.
Right.
And it raises the questions of whether we can be truly objective and a protector of both sides, or whether we actually need other players like China, like Russia, like Turkey on the other side of this equation.
Well, of course, I think Turkey has written itself out of this for the United States and as well as for the Israelis. I think both Washington and Jerusalem.
By endorsing Hamas?
Well, I mean, calling Hamas a national liberation movement. And of course, The Economist had an extraordinary piece in which demonstrated that Hamas's financial wherewithal is really based on what it has done with Turkish financial institutions. But I think it's important, and you're alluding to a very important point, is that with the rise of other powers in the region as well as in the world, it may actually produce guardrails on the United States. It may force us to do things that we haven't done over the course of the last 25 or 30 years, where we have been the power and there has been no others. And this may force us to put some guardrails on our partners in the region. It doesn't seem like we've been able to do that so far with the Israelis. And this is where the United States is caught. And this is the point that you make. We're counseling the Israelis not to do certain things, targeting civilians, to be more careful, yet we're helping give them the means to do precisely that. And that's what everybody in the world perceives, and that's a real problem for the United States. I think, going back to the beginning of our conversation, it's because President Biden himself, as well as others in the administration, miscalculated the way in which the Israelis were going to respond. They immediately defined this conflict in existential terms. That's where the bear hug, President Biden's bear hug of Prime Minister Netanyahu, was a miscalculation, because the Israelis interpret that as the president being on board in their existential struggle. A little more distance at the beginning would allow the United States perhaps a little more room now to try to restrain the Israelis. But again, I'm skeptical. When a country defines something in existential terms, no matter who it is, no matter what kind of resources they may have to bring to bear on it, on a problem, it's going to be hard to move the other country, in this case the Israelis, off of what their strategy is. Look, the Israeli public is inflamed by what happened on October 7th, has lurched to the right. Polling demonstrates that even a significant number of Israelis don't believe that the IDF is using enough force in the Gaza Strip. So there's a long way to go before the Israelis stand down.
We're in the middle of a horrible crisis.
Right.
And you've written a piece that said, guess what? There are probably more horrible crises down the road. At the end of the day, do Middle Eastern states, the Abraham Accords, do others come along and look at this incident as a game changer, or do we shove it under the rug and are destined to see this kind of horrible thing happening?
Yeah. First, let me just apologize. I don't mean to be the person who
pours cold water on solutions.
It's just, I think we do a service by recognizing the limits of American power and what's realistic in this situation. This is horrifying. There's no joy in it for me to say, hey, folks, these solutions that we talk about don't seem to be realistic. I think as far as the Abraham Accords countries go, what's interesting to me is that there have been recalls of ambassadors, but nobody has broken relations with the Israelis yet. We'll see as this unfolds whether countries that have become important to Israel, like the United Arab Emirates, like Morocco, like Bahrain, do have a limit here. I think there was a belief that their good offices with the Israelis would help somehow temper the unfolding military operations. But once again, I go back to this existential framing for the Israelis. I suspect that ties are not yet deep enough that there remains an option for these countries to move back away from the Israelis. But thus far, we haven't yet seen it. We've seen tough talk. We've seen those countries move closer to what the Arab consensus has become on this conflict. But again, there's a long way to go. Secretary Blinken told the Israel War Cabinet that it had weeks, and the Israeli defense minister said, we'll take as long as we need in order to achieve our objectives. So,
what's your gut? Are we looking at months or are we looking at weeks?
Early on, I thought that this would be wrapped up by January. I no longer believe that to be the case. I think that the push into the south really does change things. I thought the Israelis would isolate the north, kill as many people, Hamas terrorists there as they possibly could, and then target the leadership of Hamas, not push with massive amount of force into the south. And that is giving me pause and thinking that actually they are serious about this. Why serious about going in and it taking months? And this is something very different from the Israelis, who've never wanted to fight a war much longer than 2 or 3 weeks.
And finally, if you were advising President Biden right now, who is trying to influence this, what do you do with the balance of the hostages?
Yeah, I think the hostage situation is extraordinarily tough. First, we don't know how many of them are actually alive.
Right.
And I think that the Israelis have determined that the negotiations that the Qataris oversaw have run their course, and that Hamas really doesn't have the ability to hand people over, don't want to at this point, and that if anything, military pressure will force their hand, perhaps. What I would say to President Biden is, you made a mistake on October 7th and 8th. Right. It was of course appropriate to indicate your support, your shoulder-to-shoulder support with Israel, but the bear hug, the subsequent bear hug, was a mistake. And now you need to figure out a way forward. And one of those way forwards is by taking a more public stand yourself. It's one thing for the vice president, the secretary of defense, or the secretary of state to say things, but it's another thing for the president of the United States to speak out publicly about what we see unfolding in the Gaza Strip.
Well, senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, Stephen Cook, I really appreciate your candor and you being with us today. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Steve.
So what's the bottom line? The U.S. has taken this approach where it wants more food, water, and medicine to get to the victims of Israel's attack, while it gives Israel permission to keep killing. It's one of the world's worst wars, given the level of death and destruction, even considering that it was triggered by Hamas's attacks 2 months ago. The U.S. government hopes somehow that a reinvigorated Palestinian Authority can somehow be useful, or that Israel will somehow see the folly of abandoning a two-state peace plan. But my guest is right to wonder about these assumptions, especially the chances that a peace camp will ever evolve in Israel. If the international community would step up to become Palestine's protector and a steward for the time being, guaranteeing Palestinian security, autonomy, and civil justice, as well as Israeli security, until a lasting arrangement can be reached, there might be a chance. But for now, all options seem to be dead ends. And that, sadly, is the bottom line.